Well, thanks for joining us today, everyone. I am Kayla. I'm a fellow here at 50 Years. Really excited for this presentation. So to kick things off, I'll just introduce 50 Years, Impact.Tech, and Noah as well. So 50 Years was founded back in 2015 by Seth and Ella, the co-founders and partners here. And 50 Years is an early stage San Francisco-based VC supporting founders using technology to solve the world's biggest problems. And shortly after 50 Years was founded, Impact.Tech was founded, which is a seminar series focused on education and really bringing people, founders, investors, scientists, together to learn from and inspire one another about really big and instrumental issues in our society today. And we have a couple of types of seminars. So some deep dive seminars, like the one we'll be having today, really focus on the landscape of a certain space, looking at current players, growth and future direction of those spaces. And those are often delivered by experts such as Noah. We also have more recently gone into technical seminars. And one of the best examples of that was our one on intellectual property for deep tech. And we really host these to help other investors and founders in the space get to know how to overcome some of the biggest problems and just build their skill set out. All of these seminars are traditionally held at our lovely headquarters, but for obvious reasons, not possible right now. But we still want this to be a great opportunity for everyone to connect with one another and learn from one another. So with that, welcome to our 7th online seminar now in the COVID era. On to you.
Cool. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Seth. I'm a founding partner at 50 Years. I'm super excited just to see some of the faces here. We have some world-class entrepreneurs, some world-class investors in the space, some PhDs, and a bunch of folks I don't know. So, our country is literally on fire right now. The number of people that have friends or family that have lost homes to the climate crisis or have been forced to migrate because of it increases every day. But luckily, something aside from the planet is also heating up. And this is something that we should all be very happy about, and that's climate tech. But most of the focus has been on emissions reductions or decarbonizing industries. And that is critically important, and we need to accelerate even that. But it's also become quite clear that it's not enough to prevent a climate catastrophe. We also need to remove greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere. Carbon sequestration is essential to achieving our ambitious goals in fighting this climate crisis. So we need it, but what pathways are there to carbon sequestration and which ones are most promising? How does sequestration complement emissions reductions approaches? What's the current state of the technology, the market, and the policies for carbon sequestration? This seminar will explore those key questions and deep dives into how investors, entrepreneurs, and philanthropists can have the biggest impact in this field today. So our speaker, Noah, is an expert on carbon sequestration. He's the executive director and co-founder of Carbon180, which is a nonprofit on a mission to advance carbon removal solutions. Prior to founding Carbon180, he worked in consulting where he pushed forward environmental market and carbon offset modeling, financial valuation of renewable and fossil fuel energy power plants and energy efficiency, and analysis of CSR strategies. In other words, he really knows what he's talking about. And so with that, Noah, please take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Seth. And it's great to see so many familiar faces and also new friends around the virtual room here. And I'm really excited to talk with everyone today because what Seth said is exactly right, that carbon sequestration and taking carbon out of the atmosphere is absolutely essential. But when we look around, the field is, in my mind, one of just deep contradiction, where the urgency and promise is enormous, but the field has been littered with false starts, and it lags so far behind many of the other clean tech approaches. I also think we don't have a right answer for carbon sequestration today. Back to the virtual background, it's not obvious what the right answer is in this field. And that to me just makes it incredibly exciting and a place where we can all have a really big impact. It's going to require, as Seth mentioned, investment. It's going to require new people to start new companies and think about this problem in a new way, technologically, business model, and to get our hands dirty when it comes to the politics, because the country really is on fire. And we have to think about how we can marshal all of our resources that we can to get this key cornerstone of our climate strategy to a place where it's no longer just idea and promise, but it's the reality, and it's what we're working on. So very briefly, let me introduce Carbon180. We're a fairly new nonprofit. We launched about 5 years ago at UC Berkeley. And the idea of carbon removal at that time, especially to somebody who came from a fairly conventional industry background, was something that I'd literally never heard of. And that to me was just shocking, having talked to academics who just assumed that everyone that worked on climate knew we would have to do this at very large scale very soon. We couldn't really wait around for it. But it was that disconnect that to me was really motivating to launch Carbon180. And one of the things that we did early on was treat this as, well, what if we're a startup? How would we go start a new organization to build an economy that sequesters more carbon than it emits? And we found this huge portfolio of solutions, but we also talked to a whole bunch of investors and other players in the startup ecosystem. And they all said, yes, this is important, but no, we won't give you our money to do that. The conditions are just not right technologically or in terms of markets for this to actually make sense. And so that was really inspiring to us to form this nonprofit. And so we're working to change that. How do we catch the technology up to the place where it can start to be profitable? How do we start to create the same set of structures that existed for all of the other clean technologies in terms of incentives and other types of market mechanisms to get these solutions to scale? And that's where we're focused today, is how do we get that policy framework in place, and how do we bring the entrepreneurship community along and really lead that discussion in a very positive and iterative way. And so in order to understand a little bit more about the field, what I'd like to do is break the presentation up into 3 chunks. The first is all about history, more or less. And when I was introduced to carbon sequestration over a decade ago, the field looked almost entirely different than it does today. And I think it's very important to understand where that field has evolved from so that we can learn from past mistakes and see some of the things that are potentially below the radar for many of us today, but I think are really potentially path-breaking in how we move forward. We're going to spend a good chunk of time looking through that innovation landscape next. Where are the interesting companies today? What are some of the different approaches that they're taking? And also, what are some of the key gaps that I see in the field? And then last, it's going to be more of a look forward, and knowing that we'll almost certainly be wrong if we make any predictions. But with that spirit, I want to be able to share where I would like to see the field go and where I think we can actually shape the future with smart investment decisions and policy change. So I'll jump right in and let's talk about carbon sequestration. When I initially was introduced to the idea of carbon sequestration, this is one of the things that I thought about. Trees, plants, soils, this is nature's original carbon sequestration technology. As we like to say at Carbon180, has a couple 100 million years of R&D behind it. It works. We're also developing a whole suite of industrial technologies that are out there today. Some of these technologies have actually been around for decades. This enormous tower on the right hand of the screen is not a particularly innovative technology. It's one that has been proven in the field for a long time. It's a carbon capture system installed at a coal power plant in Texas that uses CO2 to make more oil via enhanced oil recovery. So you have a totally different system than the system on the left, which is a direct air capture machine. Those are the fans on top of a waste incinerator that are capturing CO2 directly from the Swiss air in Zurich and selling it to a small greenhouse, which I'm standing right in front of, taking that picture. So when we think about technology as well, we're completely in very different pathways about how carbon capture can work. And it's thinking about this enormous diversity of solutions that both gives rise to the huge potential that we have for carbon capture and storage, as well as the challenge in navigating it. So in many ways, carbon sequestration is quantum. If you zoom out far enough, it's very clear how the system behaves, how it works. But the more you zoom in, the harder it is to pin down exactly what works and what works the best. On the forest and soil carbon side, there's enormous potential to deploy solutions today. But there are major challenges on making sure that the carbon actually stays in forests and soils. It turns out that we've actually been going the opposite way for centuries on both of these ecosystem approaches. And there's a good reason for that, is that we don't value carbon as much as we value other uses of land. And so the economics make it such that there's incentives to chop down forests. There are incentives to destroy soils in order to maximize short-term productivity. These are not easy problems to solve, even if the technology of sequestering carbon in forests and soils is enormous. And it is. There's nearly 3 times as much carbon in our soils as there is in the atmosphere. And just the back of the envelope math says that we can deal with a good chunk of our emissions problem by putting carbon back into soils. On the other side of the virtual world here on this diagram, the industrial carbon capture technologies hold enormous promise, and the scalability of them is really without question. That there's enough energy, enough land, and enough storage capacity to put away all of the carbon that we've ever emitted. It's essentially running the fossil fuel extraction system in reverse. However, it's not cheap. And today, that is a huge barrier because there's almost nobody willing to pay for an atmospheric cleanup service. So figuring out how to do that and how to change the policy, technology, and markets to make this technology cheap and affordable is essential. I think where this all leads us is that all of the academics who've looked at this solution map say that there's no silver bullet. That if you really want to think about carbon removal today, it behooves us to look at a full portfolio. And so that's what we do at Carbon180, is one day this portfolio might reveal that there is a silver bullet, but all of the analysis today suggests that there are simply too many risks associated with each of the high promise solutions that it doesn't make sense for us to put all of our eggs in one basket today. I also think it's really important to disambiguate what we mean by carbon sequestration early on. We've talked a little bit about the technological and nature-based axes before, but it's also really important to think about where we are doing sequestration and what the emissions impact is. We can do sequestration on fossil energy today. That does not pull carbon out of the atmosphere, but it also doesn't put carbon into the atmosphere. However, that low or zero carbon sequestration ends up competing directly with many of the other types of decarbonization approaches that are out there. Renewable energy, the main game in town right now. On the other hand, you have technologies that can actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. But many of these approaches not only are on the more expensive side, but have completely different political economics in that they require clean energy in order to be carbon removing. And so this map is really important and it's something that almost is never talked about. When people say carbon sequestration, when they say carbon removal, when they say carbon capture and storage, it's almost never clear what exactly they are talking about within this map. And I think it's really important to be able to drill down and almost double click on what it is we are talking about in order to have an apples to apples conversation about what makes sense and what doesn't. The other really hard thing here is that there is not a carbon removing technology inherently. There are systems that can be carbon removing, but a great example is direct air capture. You could use direct air capture with renewable energy to bury CO2 underground. That is a carbon negative system. At the same time, you can take a direct air capture technology, use it to make a fuel, and that fuel itself is inherently carbon neutral or zero carbon if it's made with zero carbon hydrogen, but it does not sequester carbon. So we can't even say that direct air capture is a carbon negative technology. We can simply describe systems in which direct air capture are implemented as carbon removing or as low or zero carbon. So I think it's a very important piece for us to disambiguate as we just move forward and be very clear about what it is we're talking about. That helps us a lot. I think the other thing that's really important when it comes to carbon sequestration is everyone brings a different set of values, and many of those values are implicit. Those assumptions are not stated. And it's led to a lot of confusion about what actually matters when it comes to carbon sequestration. That in many cases, people come to carbon sequestration not because of its value as a climate solution, but because of co-benefits. People see the need to maintain and restore forests for biodiversity, for ecosystems. Carbon sequestration is a nice side benefit to many of the people that value those things and are looking for money to fund forests, for example. Some people really value permanent carbon storage. If that's really, really important and you want to be 100% certain that when you capture carbon and you put it underground, it will stay underground for hundreds, if not thousands of years, you value a very different system than soil or forests, which inherently you don't want that carbon locked away forever. That's just not how the ecology of those ecosystems works. And you don't want to try to manage those in such an artificial way. It doesn't mean that one solution is inherently better or worse. It means that we have to be really explicit about what our assumptions are. I think the other place where the assumptions really matter is on the politics. That when I was introduced to carbon capture and storage, the whole premise of carbon capture and storage was renewable energy would never be cheap enough. In order for us to meet our climate goals, we'd have to continue using fossil fuels, and we'd have to figure out a way to stop the carbon associated with those fossil fuels. Well, I think that entire premise has been radically shifted in the past decade as renewable energy has gotten as cheap as it has. And I think there's a lot of inherent political theories and political values that are associated with how we think about carbon capture and storage. And many of those values are not objective. It's worth stating those up front. So that's where we are in terms of what carbon sequestration is and what I mean when we talk about it. And I think a really important thing about carbon sequestration is inherently it is a climate technology. It's not something that we're going to do because it's going to make energy better. It doesn't. It inherently uses energy in order to capture carbon. Same thing with many of our natural ecosystems, that even though there are numerous co-benefits associated with forests, with healthy soils, there are economic incentives pushing us in the opposite direction. That if we really want to sequester carbon, we are fundamentally making a climate argument, and we're doing so in an explicit way. As I mentioned 5 years ago, it was not explicit, at least to me, from somebody who's pretty deep in the industry. I pulled this out here so that you don't have to read it, because it is page 485 of the IPCC's latest assessment report that came out a couple years ago. And even though this is the latest report, this is the first time that the report talks about carbon removal. What's in this section, however, is unambiguous. The modelers who work on climate change basically can't figure out how to get us to meet our climate goals without at least some amount of carbon removal. They remain agnostic as to how we get there in most cases, but they simply say that the assumptions that we have about reducing emissions are no longer plausible, that we will be able to cut them as fast as is needed. Again, we can prove the modeler is wrong, but the firepower and the intellectual evidence that they have assembled here is really strong and very compelling. What that enormous report boils down to essentially is this: that in order to actually deliver on that happy picture that I showed a couple of slides ago about everybody celebrating the Paris Agreement, is we have to do two things that are largely unprecedented. The first is essentially the equivalent of Moore's law for carbon emission reductions. We have to cut them in half every decade for forever, starting today. This is an enormous challenge in and of itself. The second piece is we then have to take carbon out of the atmosphere at an exponentially increasing scale, starting at on the order of 1 billion tons per year in only a decade. And by mid-century, actually getting to a scale that's roughly comparable to the amount of carbon that we emit today. We're talking tens of billions of tons just to balance our books historically. Those are two enormous challenges. And to me, it says that we need to have all of the arrows in our quiver in order to be able to do that. Both how do we reduce emissions and how do we remove residual emissions from the atmosphere. I think a key piece of that challenge is embedded in this, what I think is really beautiful new visualization from our friends at Our World in Data about where carbon emissions come from. And I think this graph shows why it's so hard for us to be able to reduce our emissions. There isn't a single place where we can focus all of our energy and get the emission reductions we need as quickly as we want to. There are simply so many diverse uses of energy and so many different industries that result in greenhouse gases that we're going to need to figure out a very comprehensive strategy, and again, a not silver bullet one. Zooming in on the hardest piece in my mind is the agriculture, forestry, and land use piece, as well as some of the industry pieces that are fundamentally not fossil fuel based, but the processes themselves result in carbon emissions. Cement is the best example of that last case, where we do use a lot of fossil fuels to make cement, but the physical chemistry of cement as we make it emits a lot of CO2. And so unless we're going to fundamentally reformulate cement, which again, not out of the question, or figure out some sort of substitute for it, we're going to need to figure out some way to deal with those emissions. This is a key use case for carbon sequestration today, both directly at those industrial production facilities, as well as taking carbon out of the atmosphere as essentially a new form of offsets. The agriculture and forestry piece is also one that's a very integrated system here, where we see a lot of emissions coming from livestock and manure, as well as deforestation and many forestry components. Those are all related in a very complex and globalized way. That many of the key drivers of deforestation are increasing meat demand. Many of the ways that we are dealing with our food system is directly contributing to losses within our forestry sector. And so this is a very challenging place to reduce emissions, but also to sequester emissions, because as the world's living standards increase, which I assume most people agree is a good thing, that we are putting pressure in the wrong direction on these emissions. The other key place where carbon sequestration is so important is industry. And the reason is heat. That today it's very expensive to make high temperature heat that is used in so much of our industrial process activities and manufacturing with renewable energy, especially with electricity. While many of these industries are likely to shrink dramatically as we decarbonize, we're not going to need as many oil refineries if we're driving electric vehicles, for example. Some of them are set to grow. Our iron and steel consumption, for example, is expected to grow as we continue to urbanize and use more iron and steel in our built environment. Again, here the challenge is, how do we supply these industries with the raw materials and power and heat that they need in a way that actually captures and does not emit carbon. So not that there are no options here, but this is a particularly challenging sector. And then even within our energy system, there are a lot of really challenging pieces to decarbonize. While we all see the impressive growth in renewable energy and in electric vehicles, there are many wedges within our overall emissions pie that are very, very challenging to decarbonize through the technologies that we have today. Aviation and shipping, I think, are two of the challenges that are not impossible, and we certainly see things like electric airplanes on the horizon. But the sheer challenge of doing the innovation as quickly as is needed for climate calls into question the need for carbon sequestration here. So I very quickly want to talk about, now that we have a sense of where in the world we'll need carbon sequestration and what I see as the main use cases, how you actually make money doing it, because I think that is the key for many of the folks here. I want to start with the old conventional mindset of this, which is we're going to capture carbon from all of our point sources that emit carbon today, and we're simply going to pay to clean up our pollution directly at the smokestack. This is an enormous report that was published by the National Petroleum Council, which not exactly the biggest climate champion in the world, but they looked out and said, well, if we were going to do carbon sequestration, what does it look like? And they focused on the US and they created this supply curve. And what they found, I think, is a very conservative estimate of what it would cost to do carbon capture and storage. And also a very interesting one with a number of key features about the industry. The first is that there is a substantial ramp up in the beginning of fairly low cost carbon capture opportunities. This doesn't matter much for climate, but it does for technology innovation. Many solutions like ethanol fermentation, like other types of industrial processes that have pure CO2 streams, have very, very low cost of carbon capture, because fundamentally the cost of carbon capture depends on the concentration of CO2 that you're trying to capture. This is thermodynamics translated into techno-economics. When we think about ethanol, it's nearly 99% CO2. All we have to do is essentially dehydrate it, compress it, and it is ready to be stored or used. That $50 a price point is actually a really important number to keep in mind, because that actually is what the United States government is willing to pay people to sequester carbon today. That there is a tax credit called the 45Q tax credit it is a production tax credit just like for wind, and it will pay you $50 a ton to sequester carbon. It was designed at that level more or less to kickstart this industry, to demonstrate that you can do this on some of these high concentration CO2 sources. And it's one of the things that once the IRS actually clarifies its guidance on how you can get this tax credit, I expect within the next couple of years, there's going to be a big opportunity here. Moving forward, there are then increasingly large quantities of lower and lower concentration CO2. When we get down to natural gas power generation, it's on the order of really 4 or 5% concentration CO2 within the flue gas stream. When we get to ambient air, 400 parts per million. So we're stepping down by orders of magnitude the concentration and thus the work required. What it's showing, however, is that even though we're stepping down by orders of magnitude in terms of the concentration, the cost actually isn't going up substantially. That even today, I think you could get a natural gas carbon capture and storage project financed if you had a predictable $100 a ton revenue stream. So even though we have incredibly few, I believe there are something like 20 large-scale carbon capture and storage projects in operation around the world, the cost is already not far away from what is economic. I think one of the emerging trends within the industry, however, is to step away from that waste management industry and try and figure out a utilization play. And here, the opportunities are really enormous. That once you have CO2, you don't have to just bury it. We're talking sequestration. We can figure out how to use it for something, either like we do today in existing markets for dry ice, for beverage carbonation. There's a whole suite of really specialized industrial uses for compressed CO2, and they're willing to pay a lot for it. And so this is a really interesting pathway, especially in the near term, as we think about opportunities. The market, however, is at the same time large and small. It's very large for a new company. Hundreds of millions of tons of CO2 are purchased every year. But we're talking about billions of tons ultimately that will need to be used. And the elephant in the room here is that the main customer for CO2 is enhanced oil recovery. Basically, people take compressed CO2, pump it underground, and use that to push out more oil. This is a very large scale, low margin operation. And so they're willing to pay only a small amount for CO2. Some of the other industries require very high purity, food grade CO2, and they're willing to pay more. We're seeing prices on the order of $100 a ton. You could go sign a contract for thousands to low millions of tons of CO2. And I think the interesting approach here is that utilization doesn't necessarily mean it's not sequestration. When it comes to fuels, that certainly is the case. You're just going to be sequestering that carbon in a fuel for at most a few months because you want to burn that fuel eventually and use it. However, the big opportunity here is in artificial aggregates, basically the other piece of cement that makes concrete. And so figuring out essentially how we mine rocks, how we manufacture rocks, a very, very basic technology to capture carbon from the air is something that holds pretty significant promise. Not to say that we're going to be able to put all of the carbon that we've ever emitted into the atmosphere into our built environment and our rocks, essentially, but it's something that is certainly worth exploring. I'll also say that when it comes to things like plastics, this is a very interesting consumer play. We touch and we feel plastics all the time. However, it's just a very small market at the end of the day. And the 300 million tons of plastics that are consumed annually are never going to really make a big dent in the climate problem, though not to say it's not an important commercialization strategy. In the interest of time, I would like to kind of quickly go through where the business case is evolving today. And I think the main place that there is interest is in California. California now has essentially a carbon removal policy tied to its transportation sector policy. The low carbon fuel standard in California trades at roughly $200 a ton today, which is essentially the price cap that the Air Resources Board put on that policy. And there are now ways for a whole range of carbon capture technologies to participate in that market and essentially get credits at that $200 a ton level. Rewinding a few slides, that $200 a ton should be sufficient to cover the cost of a wide range of carbon capture and storage projects, even direct air capture. However, a $200 a ton cap and trade is not a $200 a ton price guarantee for the indefinite future. And so it's very, very hard to get investors to finance these without an enormous haircut, which is why we're not seeing projects pop up all over the state. However, there are a lot of people working on how they can solve this financing problem, and they're, especially with the governor saying that we're not going to be selling any sort of fossil fuel combusting cars in the future, it only points to that this transportation sector policy, which is our main tool for actually achieving that, is going to stay at a high price for the indefinite future. The other way that this field is getting started is through companies. And many of these companies are tech companies, which is really interesting because tech companies are not the companies that are ultimately going to be going out and building carbon removal systems, whether it's planting forests or buying farms or building big direct air capture machines. Nevertheless, all of these companies in some form or another have said they are committing to clean up some of their cumulative carbon footprint. And they're doing it in a wide range of approaches. Some, like Stripe, are simply saying they're going to buy as much carbon removal as they can for a set volume. And they're paying a lot. They're paying between $100 and $800 a ton for some of the carbon removal projects that they're buying. Microsoft, on the other hand, has basically said they're going to shift and evolve their offset portfolio to buy carbon removal offsets. Exactly what that means, it's unclear. We are starting to see a number of investors as well. And it's interesting to see reinsurance companies, which are probably the most exposed to climate change of any business that wants to be around in 2050, like most of these companies are. They've set an internal carbon price, I believe, at $200 a ton. So there's a lot of ways that they are thinking about getting the demand for these solutions started outside of a policy or regulatory context. And so with that, what I will do is pause here as we go from our sort of historical context into where the field is today